Hello, and thanks for watching. A couple days ago I mentioned I wanted to talk about the Sweden experiment, and I wanted to explain what I meant by that. I think it's a really important comparison to be making right now. So this is some random picture of Sweden I picked up off the internet that was in the Creative Commons, and of course, if you're looking for Scandinavia and Sweden, um, there you go. So, um, 6th of April in the National Review, has Sweden found the right solution to the coronavirus? Was an article written. They said that it's a very interesting first paragraph. Let me read it. If the COVID-19 pandemic tails off in a few weeks, months before the alarmists claim it will, they will probably pivot immediately and pat themselves on the back for the brilliant social distancing controls that they have imposed on the world. They will claim that their heroic actions averted total calamity. Unfortunately, they will be wrong. And Sweden, which has done almost no mandated social distancing, will prove them wrong. Lots of people are rushing to discredit Sweden's approach, which relies more on its calibrated precautions and isolating only the most vulnerable than on imposing a full lockdown. While gatherings of more than 50 people are prohibited and high schools and colleges are closed, Sweden has kept its borders open, as well as preschools, grade schools, bars, restaurants, parks, and shops. Those things sound pretty good right about now, don't they? All right. Um, Johan Giesecke, sorry if I didn't pronounce that well, Sweden's former chief epidemiologist and advisor to the Swedish Health Agency, says that other nations have taken political, unconsidered actions that are not justified by the facts. That is, that there was not enough evidence that the epidemic was going to be that bad, and that it was more political pressure than scientific reasoning. As Fredrik Eriksson, the director of the European Center for International Political Economy in Brussels, wrote, the theory of lockdown, after all, is pretty niche, deeply illiberal, and until now untested. It's not Sweden that's conducting a mass experiment, it's everybody else. So they're arguing that, in fact, this sort of whole-scale lockdown is untested everywhere in the world, and therefore Sweden is the only control as opposed to the only experimental group, which is an interesting angle. Either way, Sweden is quite different. So Dr. Tegnell is coordinating the operation on his advice. Large swaths of the Sweden's economy remain open. He's skeptical, and this is the picture that they posted, and I'm like, he certainly looks skeptical in that picture, doesn't he? Jaw set, frown. The UK was originally following a similar strategy until some modeling done at Imperial College suggested there might be hundreds of thousands of deaths in the UK if they didn't do the more radical social distancing thing, and so they were the other country that was sort of following this path. They abandoned the path, and this disappointed the Swedes, who I think wanted other countries to follow their lead, which they believed would work. Very recently, I think that date might be wrong. Crap, it might be right. Prime Minister, I think it's supposed to be the 12th. Prime Minister Stefan Löfven has warned thousands of deaths to come, and the country's mortality rate is higher than its neighboring Denmark or Norway, where tougher measures are in place. So recently, there's been more pushback that maybe this was not the right approach, and that Sweden is in for some rocky times that maybe they didn't anticipate. So the country was one of the few in Europe to not impose these stringent lockdowns, and the Prime Minister said that after taking a flexible stance, the country's coronavirus guidance was not good enough. A spokesman for the Prime Minister said last week, we want measures that work in the long run, since this pandemic will likely continue for months. And that's an interesting thing, because total lockdown is not a viable solution for 6 months. It's been troublesome for many of us for 4 or 5 weeks. And so if a more targeted measure works as well or almost as well, then it's going to be much more sustainable. So there's a reason that could be very, very important. Well, what does the data say about this? So here we are looking at daily deaths, a 7-day running average. The 7-day running average just helps to smooth out some of the ups and downs you get in daily things. You'll see I'm comparing Scandinavian countries, and then Britain and the U.S. I also have in the data set and plotted up Switzerland, which some people think is a good comparator, and Austria because of population size and some other things. But it ended up not changing the story and just cluttering the graph, so I pushed those aside. So you can see that in terms of daily deaths, the U.S. with its not sporadic, but it's different lockdowns being imposed in different levels of rigor at different times, leads the world in deaths per day. Britain is doing a great job of not catching up, but having a very large number, both in the hundreds or thousands. And this is Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Then the Scandinavian countries appear to be having very low deaths. So that seems to be pretty compelling evidence that Sweden does not look like an outlier, and that the U.S., which is using this lockdown approach, is failing, or at least doing much less well. But there's a hidden issue here, maybe not so hidden if you're thinking about it. This is the population size of the country and the different kinds of urbanization or other things that might be going on. So it's not obvious that this comparison is fair. Just so you know, when you blow out the US and UK and say what's going on in Scandinavia, you already start saying, whoa, wait a freaking minute here. Denmark and Norway have daily deaths in the tens, and over the last 10 or 15 days, Norway's have bounced around Sweden, between 50 and 70. So that's 5 to 7 times higher than Denmark and Norway. Norway, they start this clock, by the way, starts when you have a daily death total of 5 for one day. So rather than starting on a calendar date, you're trying to show the epidemic based on the stage of the epidemic, and they're using 5 days death as the start of the clock. So that's why the differential lengths here. But it certainly looks then like maybe the UK and the US are not great comparisons, maybe, but Sweden certainly doesn't look like it's doing well relative to its neighbors, which may be important. They may be the best sort of comparison group. So this is a graphic that shows total deaths. It's from April 17th. It's very current, and you see that the US really leads all parties. Second place goes to Western Europe, Italy, Spain, France, and the UK, and then their Sweden pops up as being more than Norway and Denmark, but not outstanding relative to some of the other countries. But in the very next stanza of data from the same source, they present daily deaths in deaths per million population. So that starts getting at this issue of the proportion of individuals, and so small populations, when you look at 10 million people versus 300 million people, 100 deaths may mean something very different. So just to reorient you to this, again, we have a lot. This is not averaged over 7 days, so it's much more peaky. But what you can see is Norway in the triangles and the squares are Denmark, and this is not since starting the clock at 5 days. This is actually using the calendar dates. But you'll see, starting around April 5th, well, Sweden was already the highest in the early part of April, end of March, but not by much. But it's had some spikes into the tens of deaths per million population, and now ended up toward the end of the month at 16 deaths per million versus 1 or 2. So 8 or 10 or 12 times higher than Denmark and Norway. So it's not that Sweden's a bigger population. That can't explain it. But I want to show you one more very interesting graph. And I keep hitting my keyboard, which doesn't help. Okay, so this is the graphic now that's been adjusted to the COVID deaths per million. And you notice that Sweden is now in the darkest group with France and Spain. Italy actually isn't even in the darkest group. So the highest mortality rates per million people are Sweden, the UK, Spain, and France. Not even the US. And when you put the US and UK on the graph, UK is here and the US is here. The US had a recent jump, in part because of the way New York City started counting deaths. They started counting pneumonia deaths for people that died at home or died without a positive coronavirus diagnosis as probable coronavirus deaths if the symptoms were appropriate and there weren't other things that made it clear that someone got run over by a truck and then happened to have pneumonia, so pneumonia killed them. No, it's pneumonia that killed them. So you saw this spike in the U.S., but also you'll notice that there have been high points for Britain and for the U.S., but consistently up here, these black circles, and again it bounces up and down because it's not time averaged, but the single highest value of all belongs to Sweden. So deaths per million, at least in the last day or two, has been higher in Sweden than anywhere else in the world. And deaths per million have been higher in Sweden than in Norway and Denmark consistently. So it certainly looks like Sweden is not doing nearly as well as its its Scandinavian neighbors. And surprisingly, it doesn't necessarily look like they're doing relative to the U.S., which is having a real big problem. So getting back to the final point. So this was the 13th. Okay. This is a repeat of what I said before. Sweden's prime minister admitted Sunday, so today is Friday? In any case, a couple days ago, that their stance wasn't good enough and they're going to start taking more stringent measures. The problem, of course, is because of the time lags in development of the disease and then development of, when symptoms first occur is usually 5 to 7 days later, and then oftentimes it's the second week in which you have symptoms that you get most sick. You're not going to see changes in the death rate in Sweden in terms of improving it if social distancing is implemented and helps. You won't see that improvement for probably another 10 to 14 days. So Sweden may be in for a really rocky ride because Norway and Denmark's numbers are drifting downward very nicely. And so is Austria and Switzerland, and Austria is actually starting to talk about targeted reopening of certain kinds of businesses and so forth, whereas Sweden right now seems to be one of the hot spots where it's really a problem. So I would argue right now that Sweden has been the failed experiment, that these voluntary measures are adequate. Now it's N=1 country in this very complicated world. Countries have lots of different aspects to them in terms of population density and distribution and age distributions and social interaction. So it may not be true that the cause of Sweden's poor results right now is directly related to their taking a different approach. But right now it looks like a pretty good explanation for it. So I would argue that the swift and fairly draconian measures have been called for with this virus. Have a good day and I hope you're healthy.